Good evening. Welcome again to Biblical Insights with Bob. Tonight we're looking at one of the, shall I call him, one of the heroes of the Old Testament, Elijah. And I have kind of given this session a title called Dealing with Discouragement. Now, Elijah was a hero. He was a great man. But he got discouraged. I remember reading from a book remember Irma Bombeck? She wrote a book titled, this was the title of her book, If Life is a Bowl of Cherries, Why Am I Always in the Pits? It's funny because we can relate to that. We live in one of the greatest civilizations, one of the greatest countries in the world, and yet it's so easy to get discouraged, fearful, and so I want to talk about that for a while. Now again, Elijah was one of the most powerful men of God. He was a prophet, but look at all the things he did. He prophesied that there'd be no rain for 3.5 years. God sent him to the desert, and he was fed by ravens. Now, that may not sound real good to you, but if you're starving and a raven brings you something to eat, you're going to be pretty thankful for it. Remember at one point, he asked the widow to prepare him a meal, and there was enough meal that went on and on and on. He performed a miracle of multiplication for her. He raised a widow's son from the dead. He confronted the wicked king of Israel, Ahab. And one of the great stories of Elijah is that he took on the priests of Baal. He put them on one side. He gave them an altar. He built an altar. They could call fire down from heaven. He soaked his altar with pail after pail or barrel after barrel of water, and then he called down fire from heaven. Can you imagine that? And then he destroyed at that same scene 800 prophets of Baal. He did away with them. Then he prayed for rain, and the rain came. After 3.5 years, he prayed for rain, and the rain came. Powerful man of God. And yet, look with me at a passage from James' letter to the church, James 5:17-18. He closes his letter with this. Elijah was a powerful man, but now James says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on earth for 3 years and 6 months. Then he prayed again, and the sky poured rain, and the earth produced its fruits. The point is, he was a man with a nature like ours. I have trouble fitting myself with Elijah in those powerful moments. But I think you can join me in seeing him as we're going to look at him now in this time of discouragement. Let's read from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 4. This is right after the prophets. Remember, the king was Ahab, his wife was Jezebel. She was wicked. He had brought her in from a foreign country. She brought her gods with her, and she was wicked. In fact, I think she kind of ran the show in that kingdom. So let's read 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 4. Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and even more, if I don't make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." And he was afraid, and he arose and he ran for his life. And he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, "It's enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I'm not better than my fathers." Now, I can relate to that. Can't you? Here was a threat. If by tomorrow at this time, you're going to be dead. And he was afraid and ran for his life. Now, remember that the opposition was not just an ordinary criminal. It was the queen of the country, Jezebel. She had brought her own gods when she married Ahab, and she brought over 800 priests. These were her priests that he had killed. She was wicked, deceiving, overbearing. She had actually killed other prophets. So it wasn't just an empty threat. She'd already killed other prophets of God. Now she was focused on him, and he was afraid. Folks, we as Christians living today in this culture, it's easy to look at the leadership, to look at the powers in this world and in our country, and get afraid. Remember, James says he was like nature as ours. Now she was focused on him. He was despondent. He was discouraged. Remember, he went out there in the desert under the juniper tree and said, "Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my fathers." What did he do? He took his eyes off of the power of God. The same God that withheld the rain for 3.5 years and then brought it at the end. The same God who poured fire on his water-soaked offering. He took his eyes off of God. He fell back on his own resources, which weren't powerful enough. He ran to the desert, sat under a juniper tree. He felt so alone. He was ready to give up. The NIV translated those words, "I've had enough. Lord, take my life. I'm done." His faith was gone. You ever been there? He forgot some important facts that you and I need to remember when we find ourselves in like positions. God always has the last word. We'll find that out as we go ahead. Secondly, God's presence was with him as much under that juniper tree as it had been at the top of Mount Carmel when the fire came down. We don't always feel God's presence, but folks, it's there. He's always with us. One man with God is always a majority. I'm also reading in my devotions the book of Judges, and we see that over and over. One man with God is a majority. I remember one time I went to the hospital for some tests, and I was, like Elijah, I was kind of frightened. But as I walked through the house before I went to the hospital, I picked up a little plaque, and here's what it said. "Lord, nothing can happen to me today that you and I together can't handle." We need to remember that little saying. God's ways aren't our ways, but he's always there. And so let's look at what happened under the juniper tree in verses 5 to 8. We can see that God met him at his point of need. Verses 5 through 8. He lay down and slept under the juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him and said to him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones. I like the way the author reminds it was baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him, said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and went on the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Elijah rested. We might say that after all that excitement at the top of the mountain, that he was burnt out. Would you kind of feel that way? I had a friend that gave me a definition of burnout one time. He said, burnout comes from trying to do things without God, on our own strength. And that's what Elijah had done. He'd ran all that distance, forgot God. Now, it's true that physical exhaustion plays a big part in discouragement and depression. And I suppose after Elijah had slept and the angel woke him after that second time, maybe that depression had faded a little bit. He ate and was nourished. And again, the relationship of the physical. 950 years later, Jesus prepared a meal for a discouraged, defeated band of disciples fishing on Galilee. Remember that story in John? So the angel told him where to go to the mountain. It was a long journey, 40 days and 40 nights, probably about 300 miles. A lot must have gone through his mind on that trip of 40 days and 40 nights. But God sustained him, remember that. So he came to the mountain, Mount Horeb. Verses 9 through 14 tell us what happened, and this is important. Then he came there to a cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, and I think God says to us every time we get in that place, what are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? And Elijah said, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Sounds like a poor me statement, doesn't it? You ever been there? Verse 11. So he said, God said, go forth and stand in the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a gentle blowing. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. See, he repeated the same thing. Now, the point is here, I wanted to notice Elijah was honest before God. Did you notice, as we read those last couple of sections, the number of times the word I appeared? I alone am left. I have been zealous. I alone am left. They seek my life to take it away. When we get discouraged, we tend to focus on me. And I find that true in my life. When you get down in the dumps, say, it's all about me. And God says to him twice now, what are you doing here, Elijah? Sometimes I think we need to hear. Did you notice? And sometimes we make this mistake. There was thunder, there was a strong wind, but the voice of God wasn't in the wind, it wasn't in the thunder, it wasn't in the fire. We look for God in all the powerful places. But how did he come to him? In a still, small voice. You see, we need to get alone with God. We need to listen for God. Not look for all those great acts of God, but listen to the voice of God. He was honest about his feelings. And did you notice he was burdened for his people? He said, they've killed your prophets, your people have sinned, and I alone am left. He was alone and he was afraid. And God said to him, first of all, in the first part of that scripture, go out and stand on the mountain. Get out of this cave of self-pity. That's what we need to do. Go out and see what God can do. And God spoke to him, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. When Elijah heard that still small voice, he responded. And God repeated the question, what are you doing here? And Elijah repeated the same answer. Now at least they were communicating on a deeper level. Elijah was finally ready to listen. That's the place we have to come to in our discouragement. Listening to the still small voice. We have to come to that place where we listen to what God has to say. I like verses 15 through 18, the last section we'll read. Let's read those. Then the Lord said to him, remember, Elijah was now ready to listen. The Lord said to him, go. Sometime, in fact, almost all the time, we come to the point where we listen. God says, go, do something. And the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And it shall come about that the one who escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death, and the one who escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that have not kissed him. You notice what God said? Go. And he gave him several to anoint, but God was saying, I still got work for you to do, Elijah. I'm not done with you. There's still a mission to complete. So in my discouragement, in your discouragement, we need to listen for that still small voice. God is not finished with us. There's still a mission. You notice the final words God said, "You're not alone." Elijah felt very much alone, but God said, "I've still got 7,000 who haven't bowed their knee to Baal. You're not alone." So he departed from there. Verse 19 says, so he departed from there. He left that point of discouragement. Got to be a lesson there for us, doesn't there? Now we know the rest of the story. That wasn't the end of his greatness, even though he went through those pits of discouragement. We know the story of the chariot of fire, where God took him to heaven in a chariot of fire. We know the story when the disciples were on the mountaintop and the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, Elijah was there. God wasn't done with him. He's not done with us. So don't let discouragement get us down. God is still on the throne. Thank you for being with us again.